The phone sat on the marble counter like a live grenade. My sister Allison spoke with a practiced, icy poise that made my kitchen feel cold. "Your kids don't fit the aesthetic," she said. My daughter Lucy began to cry softly behind me. My husband Thomas grew still. He stared at her husband Brian, then calmly requested a full audit before anyone saw it coming. The silence that followed was heavy and sharp. Allison did not even flinch. She just straightened her designer blazer and smirked. I stood frozen with a half-folded Spider-Man sock in my hand. The cotton felt rough against my shaking palm. Lucy clutched her drawing of a lopsided sun, her tears spotting the yellow crayon. Beside her, Noah made explosion noises with his dinosaurs, oblivious to the sudden social execution. Allison checked her watch with a bored flick of her wrist. She looked at my mismatched laundry basket as if it were a heap of trash. My sister had finally said the quiet part out loud. Thomas did not raise his voice or move a single muscle. He just leaned back against the counter, his eyes turning to dark glass. Brian shifted his weight and tugged at his silk tie. He looked like a man who had suddenly realized the floor was made of thin ice. Thomas pulled out his phone and sent a short, silent text. The air in the room seemed to vanish. Brian tried to laugh it off, but the sound died in his throat. "It is just a birthday party, Hannah," Allison whispered. She reached for her handbag with a dismissive grace. I looked at the table where Lucy had written the word family in wobbly letters. The ink seemed to blur as my vision tunneled. For 34 years, I had been the peacekeeper who smoothed every jagged edge. I had taken the smaller bedroom and the later graduation slot. I had bowed until my back nearly broke. Now, something inside me finally snapped like a frozen lake. I set the sock down and walked toward the phone. My voice came out steady and unfamiliar. I told her we were not coming to the party at all. Allison paused, her hand hovering over the door handle. She looked at me with a mixture of confusion and genuine disgust. She told me I was being dramatic and oversensitive. I did not blink or look away. Thomas stood up straight and tucked his phone into his pocket. He looked ready to dismantle their world. Brian cleared his throat and tried to step toward my husband. He mentioned the construction contract they were supposed to sign on Monday. Thomas just smiled. But the expression did not reach his eyes. It was the same look he wore when crushing a rival. He told Brian that transparency was the new priority for their partnership. Brian's face turned a sickly shade of gray. He knew exactly what an audit would find in his messy ledgers. The social snub had triggered a financial war. Allison grabbed Madison's hand and turned to leave without a word. Her heels clicked sharply against my hardwood floors like a firing squad. She did not look back at her crying niece. I grabbed Lucy and pulled her into my lap, hiding her face. The front door slammed shut with a final, hollow thud. The house felt suddenly cavernous and strange. Noah stopped his dinosaur noises and looked up at the ceiling. He asked if Aunt Allison was mad at his drawings. Thomas knelt beside the chair and put a hand on my shoulder. His grip was warm and solid. He told me that he had been waiting for a reason to look closer. Brian had been using our name to bully his suppliers for months. The audit was not just a threat, it was a promise of total exposure. I looked at my children and felt a fierce, burning heat. We were done playing the quiet part. Monday was coming. And Brian was totally unprepared for the fallout. The hum of the refrigerator filled the void left by my sister. I gripped the countertop until my knuckles turned white. Thomas stood by the window, his silhouette dark against the afternoon light. He was not looking at the driveway. He was staring at the blank screen of his phone. Lucy sniffled against my leg, her tears wetting my jeans. I realized then that my objective had changed. I had to protect their innocence before the rot set in further. The laundry lay forgotten. We spent the next hour in a hollow, artificial silence. I packed a bag with sunscreen and water bottles. My hands were still trembling as I zipped the nylon shut. We were going to the zoo to find a world that made sense. Thomas grabbed his car keys from the hook with a sharp metallic jingle. He looked at me with a silent, heavy promise. He was already calculating the cost of Brian's betrayal. We walked to the car without speaking. The air felt thin. The parking lot at the zoo was a chaotic sea of minivans. Bright balloons bobbed in the breeze like taunts. I watched a group of kids wearing party hats walk toward the gates. My chest tightened as I saw Lucy look away. She was usually the first to notice a celebration. Today, she just stared at her scuffed sneakers. Noah asked if we could see the elephants first. Thomas nodded, but his eyes were scanning the crowd. He was looking for someone. We reached the flamingo exhibit under a blazing Colorado sun. The bird stood on one leg, pink and indifferent to our misery. A mother nearby was adjusting her daughter's silver birthday crown. Lucy froze beside the wooden railing. She asked me if she was not shiny enough for Aunt Allison. My heart shattered into 1,000 jagged pieces. I knelt on the hot concrete and pulled her close. The smell of popcorn and animal musk felt overwhelming. Noah began to cry too. "You are more than enough," I whispered into her hair. My voice was thick with a rage I could no longer hide. I looked up and saw Thomas watching us. He was standing perfectly still while the crowd flowed around him. He looked like a statue of retribution. He pulled his phone out again and made a single call. I knew he was speaking to his chief legal officer. The primary obstacle was no longer my sister. It was my own hesitation. The mid-scene turn happened near the primate house. We ran into Sarah, a woman from Allison's elite social circle. She looked at us with a strange, pitying expression. She mentioned that Allison was already telling people we had a family emergency. It was a lie designed to preserve the party's perfect image. I felt a cold clarity settle over me. Allison was not just excluding us. She was erasing us. Thomas stepped forward, his face a mask of iron. He thanked Sarah. Sarah hesitated, then leaned in to whisper something to me. She said Brian had been bragging about a new investment. He told everyone that Thomas had already wired the first $1 million. My husband's jaw tightened until a muscle jumped in his temple. The power balance shifted instantly. Brian was not just arrogant. He was committing open fraud. Thomas didn't say a word to Sarah. He just walked toward the exit. We were done with the zoo. The animals were not the predators. We loaded the kids back into the car in record time. The interior was sweltering, smelling of hot plastic and old crayons. Thomas started the engine and turned the air conditioning to maximum. He told me that Brian had crossed a line he could never uncross. Using our family name to secure illegal credit was a crime. I realized that my sister's aesthetic was built on stolen money. I felt a grim sense of satisfaction. The peacekeeper in me was dead. As we pulled out, my phone buzzed in the cup holder. It was a notification from Instagram. Allison had posted a photo of the party guests, fanned across her lawn. The caption mentioned quality over quantity. I looked at Lucy in the rearview mirror. She was finally asleep, her face peaceful. I tapped the screen and blocked Allison's profile. Then I blocked my mother. The micro twist came when Thomas handed me his tablet. Brian had just sent a desperate, pleading text. The blue light of the tablet reflected in Thomas's eyes like a warning beacon. Brian's text was a frantic scramble of words. He was begging for a signature before the bank closed on Monday morning. I looked at the digital clock on the dashboard. It was only Saturday evening. But the pressure was already mounting. My objective was clear. I needed to see exactly how deep Brian had dug this hole. Thomas steered the car toward our dark driveway. The garage door groaned open. Inside the house, the air felt stale and heavy. I ushered the children upstairs to bed, while Thomas went straight to his office. The primary obstacle was the sheer volume of lies Brian had constructed over 18 months. Thomas began pulling up shared folders and old email chains. He worked with a surgical precision that made me shiver. I stood in the doorway and watched him. Every click of the mouse felt like a hammer hitting a nail. The reality was far worse. Thomas turned the monitor toward me so I could see the highlighted rows. Brian had not just exaggerated his success. He had forged a series of letters on our company letterhead. He used these fake documents to secure high-interest loans for his expansion. The power balance shifted entirely in that moment. Brian was not just a failing businessman. He was a criminal using our reputation as a shield. I felt a cold knot of dread tighten in my stomach. He was desperate. The mid-scene turn came when Thomas opened a hidden sub-folder. He found a list of subcontractors who had not been paid in 60 days. Brian was telling these men that we were the ones withholding the funds. He was shifting the blame for his insolvency onto our shoulders. I looked at the names on the list. These were local families who relied on those paychecks. Brian was playing a dangerous game with other people's lives. He had no conscience left. He thinks he has leverage, Thomas said quietly. He pointed to a specific email sent to a venture capital group. Brian had implied that I was the one pushing for the partnership. He used our family connection as a guarantee of safety. I realized then that my silence had been his greatest tool. He counted on me being the quiet sister who never asked questions. That version of me was buried at the zoo. I told Thomas to dig deeper into the safety records. Thomas spent the next hour scrolling through project logs. He found 3 separate safety violations that Brian had paid to keep quiet. These were not minor clerical errors. They were structural risks on a new apartment complex downtown. The pressure escalated as we realized the potential for a catastrophe. If Thomas signed that contract, we would be legally liable for any future collapse. Brian was trying to sell us a ticking time bomb. The air in the office felt thick. I sat on the edge of the mahogany desk and gripped my cold coffee. We were looking at a total collapse of Brian's empire. The moral choice was no longer about a birthday party. It was about public safety and professional integrity. Thomas looked up at me with a question in his eyes. He wanted to know if I was ready for the fallout. I thought of Lucy's tears and the no riff, RAF, hashtag. I told him to pull the full audit. We moved to the kitchen to finalize the strategy. Thomas began drafting the email to his chief legal officer. He included every forged document and safety report we had uncovered. The plan was to let Brian think he was winning until Monday morning. We would allow him to celebrate his hollow victory for one more day. The silence in the kitchen was profound. I realized that my sister had no idea what was coming. Her world was built on sand. The twist arrived with a sudden, sharp knock at the back door. I jumped, nearly spilling my drink on the counter. It was late for visitors. I peered through the glass and saw Brian standing there. He was sweating despite the cool night air. He looked past me into the kitchen, searching for Thomas. He held a leather folder tightly against his chest. Brian claimed he had forgotten to show us one last detail. He looked like a cornered animal. I kept the glass door locked as Brian hovered in the porch light. His eyes were frantic, darting toward Thomas's office. I did not want him inside our house tonight. My objective was to maintain the shield of our privacy. He tapped on the glass with a heavy, gold signet ring. The sound was sharp and rhythmic like a heartbeat. He looked desperate, his expensive shirt stained with sweat at the collar. I felt a surge of cold power. He was truly terrified. "I just need 5 minutes with him," Brian pleaded. His voice was muffled by the thick glass. I looked at the leather folder he clutched like a weapon. Thomas stepped into the kitchen, his presence filling the room with a quiet, lethal energy. He signaled for me to stay back, The primary obstacle was Brian's attempt to manipulate us before the audit began. He was trying to bypass the legal channels we had just opened. Thomas reached for the lock with a slow, deliberate motion. The door swung open, letting in the humid night air. Brian stepped inside without being invited. He began talking immediately about the venture capital group. He claimed they were ready to pull out if the deal stalled. Thomas just watched him with a clinical, detached stare. He did not offer Brian a chair or a drink. The power balance shifted as Brian began to ramble. He was losing his grip on the narrative. He looked small in our brightly lit kitchen. Brian opened the folder and pulled out a single sheet of paper. He claimed it was a personal guarantee from a major silent partner. I looked at the signature at the bottom of the page. My blood turned to ice as I recognized the handwriting. It was my father's name, scrawled in thick, black ink. This was the mid-scene turn that changed everything. Brian had involved my parents in his sinking ship. He was using them as collateral for his fraud. "He is helping us get over the finish line," Brian said. He looked at me with a sickening, confident grin. I realized then that my parents were not just complicit. They were actively fueling Allison's aesthetic with their retirement savings. The pressure escalated until I felt like I might scream. My sister had truly hollowed out the entire family tree. Brian thought this reveal would soften our stance. He believed we would never hurt our own father. He was wrong. Thomas took the paper and walked to the kitchen island. He laid it flat under the light and leaned over it. He did not look shocked or angry. He looked like a man examining a forgery. He asked Brian if my father knew about the safety violations. Brian's grin faltered, his eyes wide and blinking. He claimed it was all just a misunderstanding of the codes. I watched him lie with a practiced, terrifying ease. He was a monster in a suit. The air in the kitchen grew impossibly tight. I looked at the drawing on the fridge and felt a wave of resolve. My children were the only ones worth saving from this wreckage. I told Brian that his presence was no longer required tonight. He looked at me with a flash of genuine rage. He told me to stay in my lane and let the men talk. Thomas looked up then, his eyes turning to black ice. Brian realized he had made a mistake. Thomas told Brian to leave the house immediately. He kept the folder and the forged guarantee on the island. Brian tried to reach for the paper, but Thomas blocked him. The confrontation was silent and physical, a contest of pure will. Brian backed away toward the open door, his face flushed. He told us that we were destroying everything our family had built. I told him that he had destroyed it the moment he called my kids Raff. He left. The door clicked shut, leaving us in a heavy silence. I looked at my father's signature and felt a deep, aching grief. The complication was now much larger than a construction company. My parents were either victims or co-conspirators in this massive fraud. Thomas began scanning the document to send to his legal team. We were going to have to dismantle the entire family structure. I picked up my phone and saw a new post from Allison. She was laughing. I stared at the signature on the kitchen island. My father's handwriting was unmistakable, full of sharp loops and aggressive slanting. Thomas was already typing on his laptop, his face a mask of professional coldness. My objective was now to find out if my parents were willing participants or pawns. The primary obstacle was the emotional weight of a lifetime of loyalty. If I called them now, I risked tipping our hand too early. I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the night air. The printer whirred to life, spitting out a copy of the forged guarantee. Thomas picked it up and held it to the light. He pointed to a small smudge near the date. The ink was fresh, meaning the document had been signed recently. This was the mid-scene turn that shifted the power. Brian had not just used an old signature. He had secured a new one under false pretenses. My father had likely signed it without reading the fine print. He trusted the wrong man. "We need to go over the safety logs again," Thomas said. He pulled up a digital map of the downtown apartment project. The red dots on the screen represented failed inspections. Brian had bypassed these by hiring a private firm to sign off on the work. The pressure escalated as I realized the scale of the danger. These buildings were occupied by hundreds of people. Brian was gambling with lives to maintain Allison's social standing. It was a level of depravity I couldn't grasp. I grabbed my coat and told Thomas I was going to my parents' house. He looked up, his eyes filled with a warning. He reminded me that once we started this, there was no going back. The audit was a legal requirement now, not just a threat. I nodded, my jaw tight with a newfound resolve. I had to know the truth before the sun came up. The drive was short, but it felt like an eternity. The suburban streets were eerily quiet. My parents' house was glowing with warm amber light. I let myself in with my old key, the deadbolt clicking loudly. They were in the living room, surrounded by photos of Madison. My mother was scrolling through Allison's latest party posts with a smile. She looked up and seemed surprised to see me so late. I didn't waste time on pleasantries. I laid the copy of the guarantee on the coffee table. The air in the room suddenly felt very thick and heavy. My father put on his glasses and leaned forward to look at the paper. He admitted he had signed it to help Brian secure a bridge loan. He thought he was being a good grandfather to Madison. I told him about the safety violations and the forged company letterhead. His face turned a sickly shade of gray. The power balance shifted as he realized he had mortgaged his home for a lie. My mother began to cry softly. They were totally ruined. Brian said Thomas was already on board. My father whispered. He looked at his hands, which were shaking uncontrollably. I realized that Brian had used my husband's silence as a weapon against my own parents. He had played both sides of the family against each other. The realization was a physical blow to my chest. I felt a surge of protective fury for my parents, despite their past favoritism. They were victims of a predator they had invited to dinner. I told them they needed to gather every document Brian had ever given them. We were going to need a full paper trail to protect them from the legal fallout. My mother grabbed a box from the closet, her movements frantic and clumsy. We spent the next hour sorting through piles of deceptive contracts. Every page was a new revelation of Brian's greed. He had been skimming from their accounts for over a year. He was a thief in a designer suit. We loaded the box into my car, just as the sky began to turn gray. My father hugged me, his grip weak and desperate. He told me he was sorry for everything. I didn't answer because I wasn't ready to forgive the years of being second best. I drove away, my mind racing with the legal implications. Thomas was waiting for me on the porch. The micro twist came when he showed me a news alert on his phone. A fire had broken out downtown. The sirens screamed through the dawn as Thomas gripped his phone. The screen displayed a grainy video of orange flames licking the side of the Riverside apartment complex. My heart plummeted into my stomach. That was the exact building Brian had been cutting corners on for months. Thomas did not hesitate. He called his head of security while I stood frozen on the porch. The primary objective was now survival and damage control. If that building collapsed, the blood would be on our family name. The air smelled of distant smoke and wet pavement. We drove toward the city center in a terrifying, heavy silence. The downtown skyline was bruised with columns of thick, black soot. Thomas drove with a white, knuckled grip on the leather steering wheel. I checked the news alerts every 30 seconds. One report mentioned that the fire started in the electrical room on the 4th floor. Brian had ignored the wiring warnings in the last safety log we found. The pressure was suffocating. I realized then that Brian's vanity was not just social. It was now a literal, burning catastrophe for innocent residents. Fire trucks blocked the main intersection like massive, red barriers. We jumped out of the car and ran toward the police tape. The heat was a physical wall that pushed against my chest. I saw Brian standing near a command vehicle, looking absolutely frantic. His expensive suit was wrinkled and covered in gray ash. He looked at the burning tower as if his own soul were on fire. He spotted Thomas and tried to scramble away into the crowd. He was a coward. Thomas caught him by the shoulder and spun him around. The confrontation happened amidst the roar of high-pressure water hoses. Thomas did not yell. He whispered something into Brian's ear that made the man's knees buckle. Brian started babbling about an insurance policy that would cover everything. This was the mid-scene turn that changed the stakes. Thomas pulled out the box of documents I had taken from my parents. He showed Brian the proof of his embezzlement from their retirement accounts. Brian's face turned the color of the sidewalk. He realized his escape route was blocked. The fire was just the beginning of his end. "You are going to tell the fire marshal the truth," Thomas said. His voice was cold and flat against the chaos. Brian shakingly shook his head and begged for more time. He claimed he could fix the records before the investigators arrived. I looked at the families huddled in blankets on the corner. Their lives were in plastic bags while Brian worried about his reputation. I felt a surge of pure, icy clarity. I told Brian that the aesthetic was finally over. He looked at me with genuine fear. He knew I was no longer the peacekeeper. A news crew arrived and began setting up their lights. The glare was blinding and cruel in the early morning gray. Allison stepped out of a black SUV and pushed through the crowd. She looked at the burning building and then at us. She was not crying for the victims. She was checking to see if any of her VIP friends were watching. She walked up to me and demanded that we help Brian hide the safety logs. I laughed. It was a harsh, dry sound that surprised even me. Allison was still delusional. "It is a tragedy, Hannah," Allison whispered. She tried to grab my arm with her manicured hand. I pulled away as if her touch were poisonous. I told her that she was an accomplice to a crime. She looked at the camera crews and suddenly turned pale. She realized that her social status was being broadcast in real time. The power balance was gone. The sister who had excluded my kids was now begging for my silence. I watched a beam fall from the 5th floor. It shattered on the pavement like glass. The fire marshal approached us, with a grim expression on his face. He asked for the building's primary contractor. Brian tried to point toward a subcontractor. But Thomas stepped forward. He handed over the leather folder containing the original safety violations. The primary obstacle of Brian's lies was finally dismantled. Brian began to hyperventilate as the marshal took the documents. He realized the paper trail led directly to his desk. The sirens continued to wail in the background. It was the sound of a legacy dying. I felt no pity. Thomas told the marshal that we had discovered the fraud only hours ago. He offered full cooperation and our company's resources for the victims. It was a tactical move to distance us from Brian's crimes. Brian was led away to a police car for questioning. He looked back at Allison. But she had already turned away. She was busy deleting her social media accounts on her phone. She was trying to scrub the aesthetic before the internet found her. It was too late. The tag was already trending for all the wrong reasons. We sat on the bumper of our car as the sun finally rose. The building was a blackened skeleton, but the fire was mostly contained. Thomas put his arm around me and let out a long breath. We had successfully protected our company, but the family was in ruins. I thought of my father's signature and the stolen retirement money. We were going to have to fund their lives now. It was a heavy, permanent burden. But it was the price of the truth. I looked at my suit, stained hands, and sighed. The micro twist came when a young woman approached us. She was clutching a small, terrified dog to her chest. She thanked Thomas for the early warning system he had funded for the city last year. That system had alerted the residents before the smoke became lethal. Everyone had made it out alive because of my husband's foresight. I looked at Brian's empty spot in the crowd. He had tried to kill these people. Thomas had saved them without ever telling me. He was the hero I didn't fully know. We drove home as the city began to wake up. The suburban streets felt like a different planet. I went straight to the kids' room and watched them sleep. They were safe and unshiny, and absolutely perfect. I realized that the aesthetic was a cage for the soul. I was glad it had burned to the ground. Thomas was in the kitchen, making a pot of very strong coffee. He looked older in the morning light. We had a long week of legal battles ahead of us. We were ready for it. The phone rang on the counter. I saw my mother's name on the caller ID. I hesitated, then picked it up. She was hysterical, saying the police were at her house. They were asking about the documents Brian had hidden in her basement. This was the new complication. Brian had used my parents' home as a stash for his illegal ledgers. He had made them unintended accessories to his fraud. I told her to remain silent and wait for our lawyer. The war was expanding into the very roots of our childhood home. My objective was to hand this evidence to the authorities immediately. But a heavy knock at the front door stopped me. I peered through the glass and saw my sister standing there. She had been released on bail while awaiting trial, looking pale and small without her designer armor. She was holding a single, crumpled envelope. The air felt cold. I opened the door only a few inches. Allison did not scream or demand entry this time. She just held out the paper with a trembling hand. It was a confession written in my father's sprawling script. He claimed he was the one who ignored the safety codes. My father was trying to take the fall for her crimes. The pressure in my chest became a sharp, physical pain. Allison whispered that she could not lose Madison. She was still using her daughter as a shield. He chose this, Hannah, Allison said. Her voice was a thin, dry rasp. I looked at the video still frozen on my screen. The power balance shifted as I realized she had coached him. She had convinced an old man to die in prison for her vanity. I felt a surge of pure, icy revulsion. I did not take the envelope from her hand. I told her that the truth was already in the hands of the police. Her eyes widened with a sudden, jagged terror. Thomas stepped up behind me, his hand resting on my shoulder. He told Allison that the whistleblower had already sent the footage. The fake confession in her hand was now a piece of useless paper. Allison began to shake violently as the reality finally settled. She looked at our messy backyard and the children's toys. For a moment, she seemed to realize the cost of her perfect life, but the realization came far too late. The sirens were already turning onto our quiet, suburban street. 2 cruisers pulled up to the curb with their lights flashing. Allison did not run or try to hide. She just dropped the envelope and sank to her knees on the porch. The police officers were professional and very quick. They read her the rights she had never thought would apply to her. I watched them lead her away in silver handcuffs. She looked back at me once, but I did not turn away. The peacekeeper was gone. I was finally standing in the truth. The house grew silent after the cars drove away. I sat at the table and watched the sun go down. Thomas made a pot of tea and sat beside me. He told me that my father would be cleared once they saw the video. The relief was a heavy, cold wave that washed over me. I had protected my children and saved my parents from their own daughter. The price was the total destruction of my childhood home. It was a trade I would make again. Months later, the dust had finally settled. Brian and Allison were serving their sentences in separate facilities. My parents moved into a small house nearby, living on a modest budget. We were having a small picnic in our backyard with the neighbors. There were no gold invitations or curated guest lists. There was just laughter and the smell of grilled corn. Lucy was chasing a butterfly through the grass. She looked happy and shiny in the warm light. I felt a deep sense of peace. I looked at the gate and saw a young girl standing there. It was Madison, brought over by my father. He had recently been granted temporary guardianship of her. She looked nervous, clutching a small doll to her chest. Lucy ran over and grabbed her hand without a single hesitation. They began to play together in the tall grass. I realized then that the cycle of elitism was finally broken. Madison was free from the aesthetic. The micro twist came when she smiled at me. She had her mother's eyes, but my own heart.